much, and good evening, everybody. And welcome to the latest meeting on our Say No to the EU tour. And what a good day it is to be here in Gateshead, because you might have noticed, if you've watched television or listened to the radio today, we've been treated to a whole series of political has-beens and big corporate businesses who support open-door immigration to drive down labour prices. Yes, we've been treated to the launch of the Stay in the EU campaign. Well, it's backed by some very popular people. I'm surprised to get this reaction. I mean, goodness me, it's backed by Tony Blair. Well, I've got an even better one for you. Well known to all of you as a carpetbagger MP in Hartlepool, it's also backed by Lord Mandelson. And what they're telling us is we must remain members of the European Union because it's good for business. Well, I would put it to you that it wasn't very good, was it, when we gave massively inflated prices for energy to the steelworks in Redcar, which saw them first wobble. That didn't work, did it? And they come out with rubbish, such as the really rather excellent Nissan factory at Sunderland, just about one of the most efficient car plants in the world, and we're told by, Lord Rose, that if we weren't part of this European Union, they wouldn't buy our motor cars. Well, let's just have a think about that, shall we? Yes, more rubbish, I agree with you. Yeah, sure, we manufacture motor cars in Sunderland and elsewhere in this country, and many of them we export. We export more of the motor cars made here outside the EU, but yes, we sell a large number to the EU. But unless I'm mistaken, going around Newcastle and the North East today, I saw quite a few motor cars that were from Mercedes and were from Audi, and even some, although maybe the owners are now ashamed of them, manufactured by Volkswagen. The point is, folks, they sell us 800,000 cars a year more than we sell them. The idea that the German car manufacturers wouldn't sell their products in Britain because we weren't part of a European Union is simple, arrant nonsense. And they tell us that it's the safer choice. It's safer to stay inside the European Union than not to be in the European Union. Well, I would say politically, now being a member of the European Union is frankly like being shackled to a corpse. It has a currency that is a complete failure, and isn't it a good job we didn't listen to Tony Blair, to Lord Mandelson, to Kenneth Clarke, to Michael Heseltine, and we kept the pound. And thank goodness we did keep the pound. And those same people, those self-same people who told us that investment would dry up, who told us that jobs would suffer, who told us that we would be a poorer country if we didn't join the euro, are the very same voices telling us we must remain members of this political union. And I would put it to you, they were wrong then and they're wrong now. And I thought the way that Lord Rose spoke today, which incidentally, wasn't it dull? Good Lord. I mean, it's all right being wrong in life, but have a bit of enthusiasm about it. No, I thought during that dull as ditchwater speech, what we saw was a quite deliberate deception. He kept referring to Europe. And in an interview later on in the day, he even referred to the European community. And this is a deliberate deception, because those of us that want to withdraw from the European Union, we want an amicable divorce from political union and its replacement with a genuine free trade agreement, which is what we thought we'd signed up to back in the 1970s. It is utterly ludicrous to paint us as being anti-European. I'm not anti-European. You know, I've worked for French companies, I've married European women, and I've drunk more Rioja than most people alive in Britain today. I love Europe, and we should all love Europe, but not this Europe. So that, I thought, was an absolute deception. But the thing that really stuck in my craw was when Lord Rose said that staying a member of the European Union was the patriotic thing to do. How can it be patriotic to give away your democracy, to give away control of your country, to give away the ability of your parliament and your courts to legislate in the interests of the British people? How can it be patriotic to give that away to a group of unelected bureaucrats based in Brussels? It can't, can it? Now, I'd like to use you as a little test sample this evening through a bit of audience participation, and perhaps we'll get Lord Rose at some point in time to play this game. I want to ask you, when it comes to being patriotic, I want to ask you a choice. Which is your flag? Can we see a flag, please? Is that your flag? Well, it's Lord Rose's flag, and he says the patriotic thing is to support being in an organisation that has that flag and has that anthem. But I suggest we take a look at another flag. So can they stop? Can they stop lying? Can they stop pretending that this is anything other than... They probably can't, you're right. They should stop lying, and they should stop pretending that it's patriotic to be a member of a club that takes away, in a sense, our identity, our sense of who we are. Even the British passport, if you look at it, the first two words on it are European Union. So frankly, that was the part of the speech today that I thought was utterly and thoroughly despicable. His attempt to wrap their campaign in our flag. Well, they've launched, and I have to say, genuinely, I didn't think they had a fresh, positive argument to make. They're asking us to stick with the club. They're telling us it's safer to stick with this club. Well, I would say this to you. The club we're staying a part of is not a club that will stay as it is. And when you hear the word reform, you know, I heard Rose today talk about reform, and indeed, our Prime Minister talks about reform, doesn't he? He's going to get a better deal for Britain. In fact, he told us last year at the Tory party conference that he would win back our ability to control the free movement of people. That he has surrendered. And now we're told he's going to negotiate for us not to join the euro. He's going to negotiate for them not to call it a superstate. Basically, folks, he is going to achieve absolutely nothing, nothing in this renegotiation. And when Rose and the others talk about reform, say, wouldn't it be better for us to stay inside and fight our corner? My answer to that is this. We've been trying to do that now for 40 years. And after 40 years, other than a bit of a British rebate, we are still members of a club that costs us net over £30 million a day to be a member of. We are part of a club whose courts overrule us. We are part of a club that whenever the British government actually attempts to stand up in the Council of Ministers in Brussels, well, on the 40 occasions that David Cameron's government has tried to oppose EU law, on all 40 occasions we have lost. It's not as if we haven't given this our best shot. We've tried like hell for 40 years to change the EU, and they are now hell-bent, absolutely hell-bent on reform, but it's a different kind of reform to that the In campaign will try to sell to you. I was in Strasbourg last week, and there was a debate with Angela Merkel. Oh, she looked so pleased to see me, I can't tell you. But also there was Monsieur Hollande of France. Well, he's even more unpopular in France than he is in Gateshead, believe you me. But it's actually quite difficult not to laugh when you think about Monsieur Hollande, isn't it? But what was really interesting was to listen to both of them, the heads of the two biggest, strongest countries inside the European Union, albeit the balance of power has shifted. And one of the ironies now of this project, folks, is that this idea in the 1950s that France and Germany should come together, should break bread together, should share a glass of wine together, and should trade together was an utterly, thoroughly good and sensible thing to happen after those ruinous world wars. All of that was the right idea. But part of the thinking of the project is that by binding Germany in, Germany would be contained. And actually what we've seen in the last 10 years is Germany now become the top dog, and we are now living in a German-dominated Europe. And we are. Whatever Mrs. Merkel says goes. When the Greeks have a general election and vote for a new government with a different set of policies, they're told by Mrs. Merkel, I'm sorry, but democracy doesn't matter, and you will have to do as we tell you. When Mrs. Merkel says, we will open up our doors unconditionally to anybody that sets a foot in European soil, would other countries like Hungary or Slovakia oppose, they're crushed into submission and made to share the burden. Mrs. Merkel was very clear last week that her reform is more power for the central organisations of Brussels. And Monsieur Hollande, albeit the junior partner, but what he said, I think, was significant. He said we have to move towards a full European policy. We have to move towards a full European army. And he said, I listened to what Mr. Farage said, albeit looked a bit like he was sucking a lemon, but anyway. He said, I listened to what Mr. Farage said, and the truth is, if a country does not want to be part of our political project, then they should leave it. I agree with the French. And leave it we should. Frankly, any of you in this room over the age of 57 that voted in that referendum 40 years ago, frankly, you have been conned, you have been lied to, you have been betrayed because you were told that this was to be about a common market. It has become a political union, and they've given away control of our country. And for the rest of us, under the age of 57, and I still qualify, I promise you, we've never even been given this opportunity. And our message must be a big, strong, positive message. It must be a message that we believe in democracy, that we believe in our nation, that we believe in Britain, and that we believe the best and the only people to govern this country should be the British people themselves. And when I say we believe in Britain, I actually mean it, because they don't believe in Britain. And this came home to me. Last year, I did 2 one-hour debates with Nick Clegg. Well, who is he? Who is he indeed? It was quite funny, actually, when Clegg challenged me on LBC Radio to do these live debates. Somebody wrote up on the LBC website that it's a bit like asking the toughest bloke in the pub, would you like to come outside for a punch-up? But anyway, we were talking about trade. And let none of us forget, trade is important. Britain has always been a trading nation. We were talking about trade, and Cleggers was making the argument that we needed... Listen, they've been bloody rude about me. I'm being quite nice. So Cleggers was making the argument that in a modern global world, we need to be part of a big club. We need to have clout. This is the argument that Clegg was making, and indeed it was interesting to see that Lord Rose used that same word, clout, today. And I countered that by saying, this is ridiculous. How can we, as the world's 5th largest economy, be forbidden, be banned from making our own trade deals with whomsoever we choose? And I made the point that it seemed to me that the 2.2 billion people that live in the Commonwealth, that share a common language and common law, are in many cases our own kith and kin and our real friends in the world. The first thing we ought to do once we leave the European Union is re-embrace those 2 billion people in the Commonwealth. And I pointed out to Nick, I pointed out that far from not being big enough, Iceland, with a population of 317,000, had earlier in 2014 managed to negotiate its own free trade deal with China. And I said, if Iceland's big enough to negotiate trade agreements, I'm damn certain that the United Kingdom is big enough to negotiate its own trade agreements. But then something struck me. Something struck me as Clegg was there staring into the cameras, and I turned to Nick in a friendly sort of way, and he stood still, looking straight ahead. And I said, it's all right, I'm used to being unpopular with politicians, it's fine. But something struck me at that moment, and it had never quite struck me before, and I said it. I said, the problem is, Nick, you just don't think we're good enough, do you? And that, folks, is the truth of it. I think for half a century, our politicians, since Suez, since the decline of our empire, our politicians, our leaders, have not believed in this country, have not believed in the people of this country. They've thought we need to be parcelled up and be a 9% say of something bigger. And I think, however difficult things may have been in Britain back in the 1970s, miners' strikes, 3-day weeks, 27% inflation, however difficult things may have been at times in this country, I genuinely now believe there is a new mood in this nation. It's a mood of self-confidence. It's a mood of self-belief. It's a mood that says, and I believe that we represent that here in this hall today, it's a mood that says we've had enough of negative politicians. We've had enough. that we are good enough and we want our country back. And far from all this negativity that came from the in-crowd today, that we'll be worse off, we'll be better off. Here we are in the northeast. Across the other side of the North Sea, there's a country called Norway, a country in which its people believe they are good enough, and a country that controls its own fishing rights. The Norwegians have 200 miles of the North Sea that is theirs. All the fish that swim in that 200 miles are a Norwegian asset, and any foreign fleet that wishes to fish there has to pay for the privilege to do so. And here we are in the northeast of England, where we could have 200 miles of North Sea for our fishing fleets to provide thousands of jobs for families here in this part of the world, and we have control up to 6 miles. We've given away, frankly, what is our birthright, our territorial waters, and I want them back. It's about running our own country. It's about making our own laws. It's about knowing that our own Supreme Court is supreme. It's about helping our businesses, our people. It's about putting Britain first. But vitally, folks, and crucially, and absolutely at the heart of this referendum is a subset of running our own country, and it's one that I believe will be the single most important issue in this referendum. Indeed, it is now by far the single most important political question in this country, and it is, do we have control of our borders or not? Now, well, we don't. We don't, and as members of the European Union, we don't. We have an open door. I said earlier, the first 2 words on your passport say European Union, and nearly 500 million people have got that passport. And frankly, to have opened up the doors irresponsibly to countries where the minimum wage is 1/10 of what it is in this country, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist, did you, to work out what was going to happen. And I want to put this again, please, in a sense of perspective. I said to you earlier that those that rubbish us and say we're anti-European, there was even a former Tory Chancellor the other week who was incredibly snobby about us and said we're xenophobes. We're not xenophobes. We're not against anybody. But we recognise that immigration into Britain in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s until Mr. Blair got into power. But for that half a century, we had, as a country, an open mind about controlled migration into Britain. And throughout that period, a net figure of about 30,000 people a year came to settle in Britain. Last year, that figure was 1/3 10 times anything we'd experienced in the post-war period. And frankly, I think it is wholly irresponsible of our politicians and our government to have allowed this to happen. Why do you think we have a housing crisis, the likes of which we have? How on earth can you plan for health provision? How on earth can you plan for primary school places if you haven't got a clue in the next 5 or 10 years how many people will actually be living in the country? And what about the effect of that on working men and women in Britain? Well, Lord Rose, who heads up the Remain in the EU campaign, said the other year that he thought that it was a good thing that lots of people from Romania and Bulgaria came to Britain, because it meant that for large employers like him, he had cheaper labour. Well, let me put it to you, let me put it to you that there are things in life that matter more than giant companies and multinationals accessing cheap labour. What matters more is the shape, balance and cohesion of our society, of our communities. What matters more is putting the interests of our own people first. There's been a lot of opinion polling on this. 16% of the British people support the free movement of people. 72% of people do not support the free movement of people. There was a poll the other week that said if Cameron was to renegotiate and get back some control of our borders, how would you vote? And 52% said they'd vote to stay in the European Union. When it was presented to them that he wasn't going to achieve that, only 36% said they would stay in the European Union. This is the key. There is a truth here that they cannot avoid. There is a truth here that for over a decade they've abused me on, consistently abused me on, because what they've been doing is they've been going for the man and not the bull. But the truth, folks, and what in the end will win or lose this referendum for us, is if you want to take back control of your borders, if you want to put in place an Australian-style point system so that we can choose the quantity and quality of who comes to Britain. If you want to do those things, then you have to say no to European Union, take back control of our country, take back control of our borders, and perhaps get back and take back some of that pride and self-respect that those generations who went before us had. Those men and women who stood up against evil, who stood up against the world to make sure that we could be free people. And that has been squandered. That has been thrown away by career politicians. Let's recognise the dangers of staying inside this union. Now, I talked to you about open-door migration between rich or relatively rich and poor countries, but what about the migrant crisis? Have a look at what I said in April of this year.
Four years ago, I stood here and said that bombing Libya would be a huge mistake. But of course, the UK Parliament and this Parliament were desperate. There was a clamour to go to war. And so now we have a failed state of Libya, which is now a conduit being used for criminal trafficking gangs trying to bring people to Europe. We are guilty for this crisis. We are directly guilty for the drownings that are going on. I am not blind to the human suffering that we've caused in many of these countries. I would call on this Parliament, this Commission, to end the barriers to trade, to stop the fisheries policy, to ask the United Nations to get involved and to try and help. But the real question we face is, what are we to do? Are we to go down the Australian system in dealing with this crisis? And indeed, the Australian Premier, Tony Abbott, has offered us his advice and help. Australia faced this. And Australia not only have stopped the boats from coming, they've stopped people from drowning. But no, we're not interested in what the Australians have done. We have decided that we can deal with this on our own. So we've decided that people can come and that people won't be sent back. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The definitions for who qualifies for asylum are so wide, they include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry, we simply can't accept countless millions. There is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. And there is nothing in this document that will stop those people from coming. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe. I promise my party will stand up to this impending disaster for all concerned.
So Lord Rose tells us that we're safer to stay inside the European Union. Every prediction I made back in April has come true. Europe has opened up the door not just to genuine refugees, not just to people literally fleeing in fear of their lives. It has opened up the doors to economic migrants from all over the world. Even the European Union's own figures say that over 80% of those that have not come from war-torn Syria. And in amongst that, we've already seen one of the terrorist suspects for the first Tunisian massacre landing on a beach in Italy. 5 people were arrested in Hungary having jihadist beheading videos on their phone. We are facing a genuine threat to our civilization, and I repeat what I said in that film. When ISIS say they are serious about flooding our continent with their jihadists, I would suggest, folks, they mean it. And we can't pretend we're opted out of this. Because all that has to happen is for the hundreds of thousands who come to Germany to be given German passports, and a German passport is an EU passport, which means that anybody can come here. It is not safer to stay within a European Union whose foreign policy in the Ukraine and whose attitude towards the problems in North Africa and the Middle East is putting all of us at so much peril. It is not safer to stay inside a European Union that just today has made it clear it intends to abolish the last national vetoes that exist. It makes no sense to stay inside a European Union who, when they make laws that are bad for our businesses and bad for our industries, even when we stand up in the Council of Ministers, we get outvoted 100% of the time. What is safer? What is more sensible? What is more practical than taking back control of our own lives and our own destiny and being the proud masters of our own house? That is what we must fight for. And I urge all of you that have come along this evening in such great numbers, and whether you've come along because you support the things that we say, or you're open-minded, or even if you've turned up just to remove any suspicions about how much you dislike me, whatever your motivations for coming along this evening, if you leave this hall in half an hour's time convinced of the rightness of our case, then do say to yourself that this is the biggest political vote you will have in your lifetimes. This is the biggest political opportunity. And if you believe in Britain, and if you believe that our children and grandchildren should grow up as free, proud people, then grab this opportunity with both hands. It may be the only chance we ever get. Thank you very much indeed.